Yes. Let's give it up for our man, George Washington. Yay. That deserves a second round of applause, doesn't it? Yeah. So this is our 6th YouTube lecture. We're still in period 3, but this one's going to focus on Washington's 2 administrations. And I think people really love Washington. He's the first president. And when we think of Washington, well, we just really want to dance. Why?
Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth.
Yeah. I just know there are a few of you out there that start moving your head a little bit and shaking in your chair. Of course, it's Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. First president, father of the country, blah, 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 blah. I think we really wax poetically about this particular president. You know, he does a lot of interesting things. He is the first president, so he will set the precedent for each president to come after him. Woof. Try to say that 5 times fast. So let's get right into this. His first term of office, 1789, 1793. Just a little bit of trivia. That first election that takes place in America, very different than every other one that ever happens. Because it took so long to ratify the Constitution, the election doesn't get started until December, and it actually rolls over into January. It starts in December of 88 and goes into January of 89, making Washington's first election the only one to take place in 2 different years. Trivia. Just thought you'd be interested in that. He immediately goes to work. He gets together the best of the best, a who's who of American politics, and he creates something called a cabinet. The word cabinet does not appear in the Constitution, but it does say that the President of the United States from time to time can seek advice of heads of State departments. So he gets Jefferson, Secretary of State, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, we're going to talk a lot about him, Secretary of the Treasury, and a good friend of his, Henry Knox, Secretary of War. But it's these 2 guys here, Jefferson and Hamilton. Boy, oh boy. Whenever they think of each other, it's not good. Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. There's just a lot of animosity between these 2 men on how they think government should or should not work. And eventually, because of their animosity towards each other, hey, we get political parties. Yay, parties. Maybe not. But we'll talk about this quite a bit. Judiciary Act, 1789. This is one of the first things that Washington really tries to put into motion. We know, and I say that, hopefully we know, the Constitution made up of 7 articles. The first 3 articles create our 3 branches of government. Article 1, legislature, Congress, 2 houses, Senate and the House of Representatives. Article 2, executive, president, vice president. Article 3, judiciary branch. But it was kind of vague. What exactly should this judiciary branch, this federal court system look like? Every state has state courts. We have state courts to this very day. It's courts that are only for that state. But now we're talking about a federal court system. Well, Washington proposes this before Congress. Congress gets to working, and they create the Judiciary Act of 1789. We get federal district courts in each state. But we also get this thing called circuit courts, or sometimes known as appellate, where you get to appeal decisions made in the district courts. Let's say you had to go to court in a state, at the district level, you lose your case, but you felt something was wrong constitutionally. You felt something was wrong, and that's why you lost your case. You don't get to retry your case. You're arguing over something constitutionally wasn't right during your case, and that's why you lost. So you go to an appeals court, the circuit level. And then eventually, if you don't like what happens in the circuit level, you get to go all the way to the Supreme Court, which has the final say on all matters. It's the last court. When it makes a ruling, it's done. Which is why a lot of presidents, we'll talk about this throughout the rest of the year now, they have kind of a love-hate, really, really hate kind of relationship with the Supreme Court. Because presidents don't like it when whatever they want to get done isn't exactly constitutional. But we'll talk about that a lot. throughout the course of the year. Let's move on here. Okay, let's get to our good friend Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury Department. Now, as so, he's in charge of what's going on financially in the United States, basically. Congress asked him to create a report on the state of affairs of America's economy. So he came back with this report that was something like 140,000 words long. I mean, unbelievable report he puts together. Aren't you glad I don't ever make you read that in class? I mean, we cry over reading 2 paragraphs in class, but imagine 140,000 words. Well, he said America's national debt is in 3 categories. You have debt owed to foreign nations because of the American Revolution. You have debt owed by the national government to private citizens because of the American Revolution. And debt owed by states to private citizens because of, well, the American Revolution. We're in debt. But he proposes something quite interesting. He calls it assumption. What he wants to do is he wants to take these 3 debts and assume them as one federal debt, which includes the states' debts. Take away all the debt from the states, apply it to the national debt, and have one debt for the country. Assumption. Now, northern states loved this because they were perhaps they were more in debt than the southern states were. Southern states didn't like this at all. Again, remember, we talked about this in class. The Articles of Confederation, under that government, the states had all the powers, and the southern states especially loved that. Now you have a national government, a centralized government that's going to basically overrule state laws. So the fear is that if they take on all this debt, that takes away more and more power of the states' rights issues. So southern states are not going to like this at all. Now, in class, we're going to read a little something about Jefferson where he gets involved in this. Claiming he didn't know what assumption really was, he, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison have a little dinner party one night, and they make a little agreement amongst themselves. They compromise. The southern states will go ahead with the assumption if, in fact, we take what will become the nation's capital and move it south to land basically in Virginia and Maryland area. Right? Now, I've been telling you in class about the importance of Virginia. Originally, when Washington takes the oath of office, it's New York City. New York City was acting as the capital. And there are a lot of people in the north that wanted to keep it there. There were some who said, well, let's just move it to Philadelphia, where we had all these conventions and the original Continental Congress met. But now we're going to move it further south, right? And Southern politics will come to dominate the landscape of America because of this up until the Civil War. All because Hamilton wanted his assumption to go through. But he's not done with that. He's going to place the first tariff in American history, the tariff of 1790, taxes on imported goods. It's a revenue tariff to help the country make money. And he's going to propose that the United States has an official bank, the Bank of the United States. Now, again, every state has their own banks, but this would be, one bank to rule all the banks, sort of a deal, sort of like one ring rules all the rings. This would be the bank that will establish the nation's credit. This will be the bank that will decide what currency will look like throughout all the states. It will regulate currency in other state banks. If they feel a state bank isn't, I'm going to use the word solvent enough, if the state bank doesn't really have enough credit to survive, this bank can come in. It's sort of like having your mother-in-law come into your kitchen and tell you how to cook. And again, southern states will go crazy, especially Thomas Jefferson. And we'll get into that just here in a few moments. Federal excise tax. And here are 2 terms you're going to have to really get to know. This goes into how do you interpret the Constitution. When you look at the Constitution, do you look at it as, well, what is there is implied, and if it's not written, I can imply other things from it. You're loosely interpreting the Constitution. Or do you say, if it's not in the Constitution, I can't do it. I can only do what's actually written verbatim in the Constitution. Well, that would be strict constructionism. Hamilton, believe it or not, is a loose constructionist. he likes to look at things loosely. Well, it doesn't say I can't do it, and there are some things in there that implies it. Article 1, which creates Congress, Section 8, says that Congress can create all laws that they deem necessary and proper. And that's all it says. That Congress can make any law that they deem necessary and proper. Well, what does that mean? Well, a loose constructionist will tell you, well, when something is necessary, like the Bank of the United States, and it's proper, we can do that. A strict constructionist say, no, you can't, because it would have to say banking, and nowhere in the Constitution does the word bank appear. And that's what's going to get Jefferson and Hamilton on opposite sides of the fence. Jefferson has a completely different way of viewing this country. Jefferson believes America is going to be a great agrarian society, this agrarian empire of farmers that will spread to the Mississippi and eventually beyond. He also looked at his position and Hamilton's position. Their Secretary, Jefferson Secretary of State, Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury. These are non-elected individuals. They were not elected by the people. And yet here's Hamilton, who's controlling Congress, and he wasn't elected. This angers Jefferson. And again, Jefferson is one of these guys who's always going to look at the Constitution and feel like the Constitution should be strictly enforced. It has to be something that's so sacred. And you can't be... Jefferson, I get it. Calm down. Jefferson wants it strictly interpreted. There's no mention of a bank in the Constitution. You can't have one. Interestingly, they got George Washington in on this argument. So Washington asked both these men to write an essay explaining why you think you should have a bank, Hamilton, why we think we shouldn't have a bank, Jefferson. Washington read both essays. He said both of them made a lot of sense, but Washington decided to side with Hamilton. And this was something that did not sit well with Jefferson at all. Jefferson and his good friend James Madison begin to meet secretly and complain all the time about Hamilton, how much they don't like him. And Madison says, hey, you know what? There's people in Congress. They don't particularly like Hamilton either. Really? We should get together with these guys and complain about them, because that's a lot of fun. And next thing you know, they're having pillow parties and this, that, and the everything. But hey, let's make political parties. Let's create a party to oppose Alexander Hamilton. Now, it was known as the Republican Party for republicanism, the idea of what a true republic is supposed to represent. I like to call it Jeffersonian Republicans, because this is the party that eventually becomes the Democratic Party today. It has nothing to do with the modern Republican Party, but it is the modern Democratic Party today. And obviously, we will explain how that changes, and that's going to come a few presidents later. But you can see right off the bat, there are individuals now who are not happy. Now, in class, we're going to talk about factions and James Madison, how he thought about factions. And here, factions are forming, and one faction eventually creates an actual political party, Jeffersonian Republicans. And it's interesting that Madison didn't like factions, and yet he helps, through a faction, create one of the strongest political parties ever. So let's go into Washington's second term. His second term, 1793-1797, dominated by foreign events. Washington did not want to be a foreign policy president. There are a lot of presidents who really don't want to get involved in this. Unfortunately, the French Revolution has taken place. And the French Revolution is going to dominate Washington's, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. 4 presidents will be, their entire foreign policy is going to be affected because of the French Revolution, because it's going to cause wars in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars eventually come out of this. England gets involved, and it's just going to drag America down the rabbit hole with it. They're trying to impose a constitutional monarchy. Eventually, they take the King Louis XVI, and they cut his head off. And these are the things that Washington begins to say, you know, maybe we don't want to be involved in this. So Washington issues a neutrality proclamation. He declares the United States will stay neutral Washington is a guy who doesn't want America involved in European affairs. Later in the week, we're going to read his famous farewell address, where he warns of entangling alliances with the Europeans. And that will become the basis of American foreign policy up until World War I, where America will try its best to stay out of foreign policies and try to have no alliances with European powers. Again, this brings individuals to America, like this French citizen, Edmond Genet, who comes and tries to enlist America's help, and that causes a lot of controversy. The British are, they particularly don't like America because, that whole American Revolution thing. They're still a little bit peeved, so they start pushing America around a lot, and they start a process called impressment. What this is the British Navy will constantly stop American merchant ships, not naval ships, not ships of war, but merchant ships. They will go on board and they will randomly get men that they claim are deserters of the British Empire and impress them or force them to join the British Navy. And we're talking thousands of men will be affected because of this. And if they don't join the Navy, they're sent back to England to live out the rest of their lives in a prison. Washington sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty, and it's a terrible treaty. The British will not talk about impressment. You're not allowed to mention the word impressment, sort of like Fight Club. But they do talk about, after the American Revolution, England maintained forts in the Ohio River Valley, and they did not take the forts out. So these British men, talking to John Jay, now hopefully you remember this name. John Jay was one of the negotiators for the peace treaty after the American Revolution in 1783. And he was speaking with the exact same men in 1783 he's speaking now with in 1794. And in 1783, they promised to take the forts out of Ohio. Here we are now in 94, right? 11 years later, and they're still there. And now they promise yet again to take the forts out. And you know what? They still don't. They still don't. This is a terrible treaty. It made a lot of people angry with Washington, but a good thing came out of it. Pinckney's Treaty. Spain had no idea why John Jay was in England. Spain begins to fear that maybe a military alliance is being formed. Spain was also pushing around America because Spain controlled Florida. They controlled Louisiana Territory at this time period and the port of New Orleans. They were refusing to allow American merchants to sail the Mississippi River. So they immediately contact the American diplomat, this Pinckney guy, and they go into a treaty that allows America now to navigate the Mississippi River and to use the port of New Orleans for trade. Only to find out afterwards that Jay's treaty wasn't exactly what they thought it was. The Whiskey Rebellion took place in the United States. Alexander Hamilton, if you saw earlier, was trying to impose an excise tax, a tax specifically on whiskey, which would raise a lot of revenue for America because, America really likes its whiskey. What can I tell you? And whiskey farmers in Pennsylvania, Scotch-Irish whiskey farmers, I'll point that out to you, they were Scotch-Irish descent, decided they weren't going to pay the tax. And they were going to start tar and feathering federal agents. Washington said no. Washington himself raises an army. Washington puts on his old general uniform and marches into Pennsylvania. Can you imagine that? Imagine Barack Obama at the head of an army wearing a uniform. That just doesn't make any sense to us. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. I think my dog's going to start barking. Yep. I live in a townhome community, and they're mowing our lawn out there. So sorry about that. So the Whiskey Rebellion. Just the sight of this army, these rebels throw down their guns and run away. But it proved two things. The Whiskey Rebellion proved that the federal government has a right to tax citizens, and secondly, it proves that the federal government can enforce said tax. So it has the right to tax us, it has the right to enforce the tax. Indians were not happy with America. I'm, surprised. And again, a confederation of Indian troops, Miami Indians, were part of this, went to war, and were winning this war against the American military until the Battle of Fallen Timbers of 1794, where the American military basically routs the Indians. And this forced the Indian tribes to sign the Treaty of Greenville. Basically, the Treaty of Greenville, all that Northwest territory, from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, up into Wisconsin and Michigan, Indians are no longer going to be allowed to claim land rights there. They can still live there and hunt, but they cannot claim any of this as their land anymore. The American government is also going to pay them an annual salary, supposedly, wink, wink, to keep them happy. All right, well, that's it. If you want to read more about this, please do. Pages 204, 210 in our textbook. And I look forward to seeing everybody later. All right, bye.